year was 1415, and the muddy fields of Agincourt lay silent except for the groans of dying men and the distant cries of carrion birds circling overhead. What had begun as a glorious charge of French nobility had ended in catastrophic defeat, leaving thousands of bodies scattered across the blood-soaked earth like broken dolls discarded by some vengeful god. But for the English knights who surveyed this scene of carnage, the battle itself was only the beginning of their work. What happened next would reveal the true nature of medieval warfare and the cold, calculated rituals that transformed chaos into order. Most people imagine that medieval battles ended when the last sword fell silent, that victorious knights simply walked away from the field to celebrate their triumph. This romantic notion couldn't be further from the brutal reality. The aftermath of medieval combat was a carefully orchestrated dance of death, profit, and politics that could determine the fate of kingdoms. Every corpse held secrets. Every piece of armor told a story, and every decision made in those crucial hours after victory could echo through history for generations to come. The English understood something that their enemies often overlooked. Victory wasn't just about defeating your opponent on the battlefield. It was about what you did with that victory afterward. The systematic way they handled the dead, the living, and everything in between revealed a level of strategic thinking that went far beyond simple martial prowess. These weren't just warriors drunk on conquest. They were administrators of death, accountants of carnage, and architects of their own legend. When the dust settled at Agincourt, Henry V's men faced a problem that would have overwhelmed lesser armies. Before them lay approximately 6,000 French dead, their bodies creating a landscape of human devastation that stretched as far as the eye could see. The sheer scale of the slaughter was unprecedented, but the English response was immediate and methodical. They had protocols for this, procedures that had been refined through generations of warfare, and they implemented them with the same precision they had shown in battle. The first priority was always the identification of high-value prisoners and the recovery of their own dead. English knights moved through the carnage with practiced efficiency, turning over bodies and examining faces with the detached professionalism of men who had done this work many times before. They carried with them detailed knowledge of French heraldry, able to identify noble houses by the symbols emblazoned on surcoats and shields. This wasn't mere curiosity. The ransom value of a captured French duke could fund an entire campaign, while the body of a dead earl might need to be preserved for diplomatic purposes. The process was surprisingly systematic. Teams of soldiers worked in organized sweeps across the battlefield, each group assigned to specific sections. They moved with purpose, checking every fallen figure for signs of life, wealth, or political importance. Those French nobles found alive were immediately secured and transported to makeshift holding areas where their wounds could be treated. After all, a dead prisoner was worthless, but a living one could be worth a king's ransom. But the English weren't content with simply collecting the obvious prizes. They understood that information was as valuable as gold, and the battlefield was rich with intelligence waiting to be harvested. Documents carried by French commanders revealed troop movements, supply routes, and strategic plans for future campaigns. Personal letters provided insights into the political relationships between French noble houses, information that could be exploited in future diplomatic negotiations. The systematic stripping of the dead began almost immediately after the identification process was complete. This wasn't the chaotic looting that characterized some armies, but a regulated procedure overseen by officers who ensured that the most valuable items were collected and catalogued. Armor, weapons, jewelry, and personal effects were gathered and sorted according to their worth and strategic value. The finest pieces would be sent back to England as trophies, while serviceable equipment would be redistributed among the English forces. What happened to the bodies themselves depended entirely on their status and political value. French nobles of high rank received treatment that bordered on reverent. Their bodies were carefully cleaned, prepared for preservation, and often embalmed using techniques learned from the Crusades. These corpses would be returned to their families in France, but only after appropriate negotiations regarding ransom payments for living prisoners had been concluded. The dead could be powerful bargaining chips in the complex web of medieval diplomacy. For the common French soldiers, the treatment was far more pragmatic. Mass graves were dug by English soldiers and local peasants pressed into service, with bodies buried in layers according to military efficiency rather than religious ceremony. The English understood that leaving thousands of corpses exposed to the elements would create a health hazard that could devastate their own forces through disease. Speed was essential, and sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford. The English had learned valuable lessons from previous campaigns about the importance of battlefield cleanup. Disease killed more medieval soldiers than combat ever did, and an army that didn't properly dispose of the dead was an army that invited plague into its own ranks. They employed techniques that were surprisingly sophisticated for the era, using lime to accelerate decomposition and prevent the spread of infection. Local water sources were tested and often redirected to prevent contamination from seeping corpses. Religious considerations played a crucial role in these proceedings, but they were balanced against practical necessities. English chaplains moved among the dead, providing last rites for fallen comrades and enemy soldiers alike. But they did so efficiently and without the elaborate ceremonies that characterized peacetime burials. The Church's requirement for proper Christian burial was acknowledged, but it was subordinated to the immediate needs of the army and the crown. The treatment of enemy dead also served a darker purpose that went beyond simple disposal of bodies. The English understood the psychological impact of their actions on both their own forces and their enemies. Word would spread throughout France about what had happened at Agincourt, and the methodical, almost industrial way the English had processed the dead would become part of the legend. This wasn't accidental. It was psychological warfare of the highest order. Local populations were forced to participate in the cleanup process, a practice that served multiple functions. It provided the necessary manpower for the enormous task of dealing with thousands of bodies, but it also demonstrated English control over the conquered territory. French peasants digging graves for their own nobles, while English knights supervised, was a powerful symbol of the new political reality. The English also paid careful attention to the recovery and redistribution of weapons and armour. Medieval warfare was expensive, and every piece of serviceable equipment represented significant value. Damaged items were collected for repair, while broken weapons were salvaged for their metal content. The English had mobile smithies that could work battlefield salvage into usable equipment within days of a victory. Intelligence gathering continued throughout the cleanup process. Prisoners were interrogated systematically, with information cross-referenced against documents recovered from the dead and observations made during the battle itself. This intelligence would shape English strategy for months to come, influencing decisions about where to attack next and which French nobles might be susceptible to bribery or coercion. The speech was any standard, but it was particularly impressive given the scale of the carnage at Agincourt. Within 3 days of the battle, the field had been cleared, the dead buried or processed, prisoners secured and catalogued, and valuable intelligence extracted and analysed. The English army was ready to march, leaving behind only carefully maintained graves and local populations who had witnessed the full extent of English organisational capability. This systematic approach to battlefield aftermath wasn't unique to Agincourt. It represented centuries of refined practice, lessons learned through countless campaigns, and passed down through generations of English military leadership. The knights who supervised these operations weren't just warriors. They were the inheritors of an institutional knowledge that gave them decisive advantages over enemies who viewed war as primarily a matter of individual courage and martial skill. The aftermath procedures extended far beyond the immediate battlefield, creating a network of operations that would have impressed modern military planners. English commanders established forward processing stations where captured materials could be properly evaluated and documented. These weren't haphazard collections of loot, but carefully organized inventories that tracked everything from the humblest cooking pot to the most elaborate ceremonial sword. Every item told a story, and the English were determined to read them all. The most valuable discoveries often came from the most unexpected sources. A simple leather pouch carried by a minor French knight might contain correspondence that revealed the location of enemy supply depots. A signet ring, taken from a fallen squire, could provide the key to understanding complex family alliances that might be exploited in future campaigns. The English had learned that wars were won as much by information as by steel, and they treated the battlefield as a vast library of strategic intelligence. Personal effects received particular attention from English officers trained in the art of political warfare. They understood that a man's possessions revealed his connections, his wealth, his fears, and his ambitions. Letters from wives and lovers were translated and analysed for clues about morale in French territories. Religious medallions and prayer books provided insights into the spiritual state of enemy forces. Even gambling dice and playing cards were examined for evidence of the social dynamics within French military units. The English approach to prisoner management revealed their sophisticated understanding of medieval politics and economics. High-ranking captives weren't simply locked away and forgotten. They were housed according to their station, treated with the courtesy due their rank, and carefully maintained as valuable assets. These men represented walking treasuries, and their health and well-being directly impacted the financial success of the campaign. Negotiations for prisoner releases began almost immediately, conducted through a complex network of intermediaries that included church officials, merchants, and diplomatic agents. The English had developed detailed protocols for assessing ransom values based on family wealth, political connections, and strategic importance. A duke's son might be worth 10,000 gold pieces, while a minor baron could command perhaps 50. These weren't arbitrary numbers, but carefully calculated assessments based on extensive intelligence about French aristocratic finances. The treatment of wounded prisoners presented particular challenges that tested English organisational capabilities. Medical care was provided not out of humanitarian concern, but as a practical necessity to preserve valuable assets. English field surgeons, many of whom had learned their craft during previous campaigns, worked to keep high-value prisoners alive and healthy enough to survive the journey back to England. Death from infection or neglect meant the loss of potential ransom payments that could fund future military operations. Lower-ranking prisoners faced a more uncertain fate. Common soldiers captured during the battle often found themselves pressed into service as labourers, helping with the very clean-up operations that processed their fallen comrades. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, but calculated efficiency. These men possessed local knowledge that could prove valuable, and their labour reduced the burden on English forces while demonstrating the consequences of resistance. The psychological impact of these operations extended far beyond the immediate participants. Word of English efficiency in processing the dead and managing prisoners spread throughout France with remarkable speed. Merchants, pilgrims, and refugees carried tales of the methodical way the English had transformed chaos into order. These stories served English interests perfectly, creating an aura of invincibility that could cow potential enemies before battles were even fought. Local French nobles who hadn't participated in the battle at Agincourt found themselves facing a terrible dilemma. The systematic way the English had processed their defeated countrymen sent a clear message about the fate that awaited those who chose to resist. Some began sending envoys to English commanders, seeking terms for surrender before their own territories were invaded. Others fortified their holdings and prepared for sieges, but always with the knowledge that defeat might mean not just death, but methodical processing by an enemy that had turned warfare into an administrative science. The English also understood the importance of controlling the narrative surrounding their victory. Official accounts of the battle and its aftermath were carefully crafted to emphasize English valor while highlighting the systematic nature of their post-battle operations. These reports would be circulated throughout Europe, serving both as propaganda tools and as warnings to potential enemies. The message was clear. English victory wasn't just complete, it was professional. Religious ceremonies conducted over mass graves served multiple purposes beyond the obvious spiritual ones. English chaplains performed services that demonstrated proper Christian treatment of the dead, countering potential French propaganda about English barbarism. But these same ceremonies also reinforced the finality of French defeat, creating sacred spaces that marked English dominance over the landscape itself. The processing of battlefield salvage revealed the English understanding of medieval economics and supply chains. Damaged armor could be repaired and resold, generating revenue that helped offset campaign costs. Broken weapons provided raw materials for English smithies, reducing dependence on uncertain supply lines from England. Even seemingly worthless items like torn clothing and leather goods were collected and sorted, as they could be repurposed for bandages, padding, or other military necessities. Intelligence operations continued long after the battlefield had been cleared. Prisoners were interrogated in detail about French military capabilities, defensive preparations, and political divisions. This information was cross-referenced with documents recovered from the dead and observations made during combat to come, shaping decisions about which. The resulting intelligence reports would influence English strategy for years' territories to attack, and which French leaders pressure. The English might be vulnerable to diplomatic, also developed sophisticated methods for exploiting the social hierarchies revealed by battlefield casualties. The death of a particular French commander might create opportunities to approach his subordinates with offers of employment or protection. Noble families grieving their losses could be approached with proposals for political alliances that would have been unthinkable before their military power had been broken. Every death created ripple effects that skilled English diplomats were prepared to exploit. Perhaps most remarkably, the English maintained detailed records of all these operations. Clerks accompanying the army documented prisoner identities, catalogued recovered materials, and tracked the disposition of bodies and salvage. These weren't casual notes, but formal records that would be reviewed by royal officials and used to plan future campaigns. The English had transformed medieval warfare into a bureaucratic enterprise, complete with paperwork and administrative oversight. The speed and efficiency of these operations became legendary among professional soldiers throughout Europe. Military observers from other kingdoms studied English methods, attempting to understand how a relatively small island nation could achieve such systematic dominance over larger continental powers. The answer lay not just in superior tactics or equipment, but in the relentless organization that turned every aspect of warfare into a professional discipline. As the English prepared to march away from Agincourt, they left behind a landscape that had been fundamentally transformed. The chaotic battlefield had become an ordered space where every element served English strategic interests. The dead had been properly buried or processed according to their value. Prisoners had been secured and catalogued. Intelligence had been extracted and analysed, and local populations had been thoroughly educated about the consequences of opposing English power. This systematic approach to victory's aftermath would become a hallmark of English military operations for generations to come. It represented something entirely new in medieval warfare, the complete industrialization of conquest, where every aspect of victory was processed, catalogued, and exploited for maximum strategic advantage. But the English innovation extended far beyond mere battlefield administration. They had developed what amounted to a medieval intelligence network that would make modern spy agencies envious. Every captured document was translated by educated clerks who travelled with the army specifically for this purpose. These men weren't just scribes, but trained analysts who understood the political landscape of medieval France better than many French nobles themselves. They could read between the lines of personal correspondence, identifying coded references to troop movements, supply shortages, and political dissent that might be exploited in future operations. The systematic interrogation of prisoners revealed layers of strategic thinking that separated English commanders from their continental counterparts. Each captive was questioned not just about immediate military matters, but about the broader political and economic conditions in their home territories. A captured knight from Normandy might provide information about harvest yields that would influence English decisions about where to establish winter quarters. A squire from Burgundy could reveal details about internal disputes between noble families that might be exploited to prevent French unity in future campaigns. What emerged from these interrogations was a detailed map of French vulnerabilities that went far beyond simple military intelligence. The English learned which regions were suffering from poor harvests, which noble houses were feuding with their neighbours, and which territories might welcome English rule as preferable to their current overlords. This information was carefully catalogued and cross-referenced, creating a database of strategic knowledge that would guide English policy for decades. The treatment of captured French standards and heraldic symbols revealed another dimension of English psychological warfare. Rather than simply destroying these emblems of enemy pride, the English often preserved them as trophies to be displayed in England's great cathedrals and royal palaces. The sight of French battle flags hanging in Westminster Abbey or Winchester Cathedral sent a powerful message to both English subjects and foreign visitors about the reach of English military power. These weren't mere decorations, but carefully chosen symbols designed to reinforce narratives of English supremacy. Local populations found themselves unwilling participants in English information-gathering operations. French peasants were questioned extensively about local conditions, recent troop movements, and the loyalty of their noble overlords. The English had learned that common people often possessed more accurate intelligence about military preparations than captured knights, who might be motivated to lie or mislead their captors. A farmer who had sold grain to passing soldiers could provide precise details about unit strengths and destinations that no amount of torture might extract from a captured officer. The systematic collection of personal effects from the dead served purposes that went well beyond simple looting. English officers understood that a man's possessions told the story of his life, his connections, and his weaknesses. A love letter carried into battle might reveal family connections that could be exploited in future diplomatic negotiations. A debt record tucked into a dead knight's purse could provide leverage over surviving relatives. Even religious items were examined for clues about the spiritual and political loyalties of enemy forces. The English had also developed sophisticated methods for managing the logistical challenges of large-scale prisoner operations. Captured French nobles weren't simply marched back to England in chains, but were organised into carefully managed groups based on their ransom value and political importance. High-value prisoners travelled under heavy guard with their own servants and even personal physicians to ensure they arrived in England healthy enough to command maximum prices. Lesser captives were organised into work gangs that helped transport captured materials and assisted with ongoing military operations. The processing of battlefield dead revealed English understanding of medieval medical knowledge and public health concerns. Bodies showing signs of disease were handled with special precautions and buried separately to prevent contamination of English forces. Corpses were examined not just for valuables, but for evidence of malnutrition, illness, or other conditions that might indicate broader problems within French military organisation. A systematic pattern of disease among enemy dead could suggest vulnerabilities in French supply systems that might be exploited in future campaigns. Religious considerations were carefully balanced against practical necessities in ways that demonstrated sophisticated political thinking. English chaplains conducted burial services that satisfied church requirements while also serving propaganda purposes. These ceremonies were often attended by local French clergy, who could later testify to English respect for Christian burial practices, countering potential accusations of barbarism. But the same services also reinforced English control over conquered territories by demonstrating their power to grant or withhold proper burial rites. The speed with which these operations were conducted reflected years of institutional learning and practice. English commanders had developed detailed protocols for every aspect of post-battle management, from the initial sweep for survivors to the final transportation of prisoners and loot. These weren't improvised procedures, but carefully refined systems that had been tested and improved through countless campaigns. The result was an administrative efficiency that could transform the chaos of medieval warfare into organized profit within days of victory. Communication networks established during these operations extended English influence far beyond the immediate battlefield. Messengers were dispatched to carry news of victory back to England, but they also carried carefully crafted accounts designed to influence political opinion throughout Europe. Allied kingdoms received versions of events that emphasized English military prowess, while neutral powers received messages calculated to discourage any thoughts of opposing English expansion. Even enemy territories received communications designed to encourage surrender and collaboration. The English understanding of medieval economics influenced every aspect of their battlefield operations. They had calculated the precise costs of various military activities and structured their post-battle procedures to maximize financial returns. The ransom value of captured nobles had to be balanced against the costs of housing and guarding them during transportation to England. Battlefield salvage operations were conducted with careful attention to the relative values of different materials and the transportation costs involved in moving them to markets where they could be sold. Medical care for wounded prisoners represented a significant investment that demonstrated English long-term strategic thinking. Field surgeons treated captured French nobles not from humanitarian motives, but because death from preventable causes represented a direct financial loss. The English had developed surprisingly sophisticated techniques for battlefield medicine, learned through decades of campaign experience and contact with medical knowledge preserved in monastery libraries and brought back from crusading expeditions. The psychological impact of English efficiency extended throughout the French military hierarchy. Surviving French commanders who witnessed English post-battle operations reported back to their superiors about the methodical nature of English military administration. These accounts spread fear throughout French military circles, creating a reputation for English invincibility that often proved as valuable as actual military victories. French knights began to question whether resistance was worthwhile when defeat meant not just death, but systematic processing by an enemy that had reduced warfare to an administrative science. Local French nobles found themselves facing impossible choices as word of English methods spread throughout the kingdom. Those who had avoided direct confrontation with English forces now understood the full implications of potential defeat. Some began secretly seeking terms that negotiating with English representatives might preserve their lands and positions. Others doubled down on resistance, but always with the knowledge that failure meant not just personal destruction, but the systematic dismantling of everything they had built. The English knights who walked among the dead at Agincourt weren't just warriors claiming victory. They were architects of a new kind of warfare, one where the battle's end marked the beginning of an even more crucial campaign against chaos itself. Their systematic processing of corpses, prisoners, and plunder transformed medieval combat from a contest of courage into an industrial enterprise of conquest. In death as in life, everything served England's relentless march toward dominance.